Good evening, everybody. Welcome to History Author Talks. Well, since nothing is going on in the news tonight, I thought it would be fun for all of us to go back to the 18th century, as we all love to do. And tonight, I think we've got a very special program for you. We've got a good group tonight, and I want to just make a few announcements, let people know some of the things that are going on. We're moving into springtime. We had 77-degree weather here in New Jersey today. I've already started giving tours of the Washington Crossing, battles of Trenton and Princeton. Gave a great tour just yesterday to a family from San Diego, California. I've got another one coming up from Florida next week. I love giving these tours. So people want to learn about Washington Crossing, Trenton, and Princeton, and you're in the central Jersey area, certainly take a look at 10crucialdays.org, and we will be happy to give you a tour. I also, now is when the schools start coming to our historic sites. Last week, we had 240 seventh graders come to Washington Crossing Historic Park, and I get dressed up in my Sons of the American Revolution color guard uniform, and I love to talk to the kids about the American Revolution. I've got another school district. I'm going to be doing the entire fifth grade in 4 days. So I think it's very important to volunteer and support our historic sites. So I encourage you all to do that. Our musical, The Crossing in the 10 Crucial Days, is gearing up for summer season, where we have made some new changes to the program, and we're looking for venues where we're going to be putting on The Crossing revolutionary new musical sometime this fall. So you're going to hear updates about that. As with all my programs, you can go to the historyauthortalks.com. You'll see the bookshop button up in the upper right-hand corner. When you purchase books, a portion of the proceeds goes to the Sons of the American Revolution library. So I encourage you to purchase our authors' books. Obviously, they're doing it because they're fascinated in this, but we also want to make sure that you have an opportunity to actually read their books. You only hear 1 hour of what their books are about here on the program, so we want you to indeed purchase their books at historyauthortalks.com. So with that, I am pleased to now bring our author into the program. I wanted to move some papers around here. Jim Stempel is an author of about 10 books and numerous articles on American history, warfare, and spirituality. Nice mix there for sure. He resides in rural Maryland with his wife and family. And with that, I'm welcoming our author tonight, Jim Stempel. So I'm going to add him to the program. Jim, welcome to historyauthortalks.com.
Great, thank you. It's great to be with you.
So Jim, I'm pleased to have you with us. I mentioned to everyone that you live in Maryland now, but tell everyone where you came from originally.
Yeah, I was born and raised in central New Jersey, in Westfield, and I was there for my first 26 years. So I was particularly interested in this period of time. We were discussing it, you and you had brought up the idea that there was a lot of action during this period. I had never heard of any of it. I'd never been taught anything. So I started looking into the 1777 period in New Jersey, and I started finding all sorts of things I had never known before. And it was really shocking to me. Like I said, I was born and raised in Westfield, and there was all sorts of myth and lore about the British marching through and all these things that happened. When I was a kid, I used to ride my bike on Gallows Hill Road, where a British spy had supposedly been hung And I remember being pretty little and at times kind of looking around over my shoulder, wondering if I was about to be attacked by a ghost. Well, what I found out was that a lot of that lore was just that, just lore. But so much more had happened that I was stunned. In my own hometown, the entire operational British Army one night marched in 16,000 strong in 2 divisions, tore the town apart, destroyed the Presbyterian church, marched off with almost all the money in town and most of the livestock. I had never heard any of that when I was a young man. So I was really shocked. And I started looking more and more into this period of time. It took me a while, but I put together that there was a lot of fighting and a lot of maneuver going on in New Jersey during this period of time that I had never heard of before. And I thought a lot of people would like to hear about it. I mean, basically, this is an 8-month period in the American Revolution. It's like it fell off the end of the table and got lost somewhere along the line.
So before we delve into this new book, tell us a little bit about your earlier books. How did you come to actually writing about the American Revolution, and what were some of your earlier books?
Okay, well, what motivated me was that I was doing some talks on a lot of different things, and I was meeting with a lot of different groups of people, and a lot of it was I was bumping up against college-age kids and maybe graduate level students and things like that. And I was becoming aware of the fact that they didn't know anything really about American history. I mean, anything, even the most basic, like the 10 Crucial Days, Trenton, things like that. They didn't know anything. So after a while, I started kind of scratching my head, and I thought, if you don't have an appreciation for your history of your country, an appreciation of what you've been given, you're more likely to give it away than somebody who understands everything that has gone into giving you the country. So I decided, well, I was going to start writing some history books, and I started looking around for things. I thought I would like to find some things that are a little bit unusual, not known of that well, but were important and really interesting. I mean, everybody's written. I started looking at the Civil War. I live here in Maryland right now. My first interest was really the Civil War. Gettysburg's not far away from where I live, but shoot, I mean, there are hundreds of books written about Gettysburg. So I was looking around for something different. And I wrote, some of the first things I wrote about a book called Albemarle, which was about William Cushing's attack on the Albemarle during the Civil War. An amazing story if you've ever read it. I went on and wrote a book about the battle at Cowpens, because Daniel Morgan attracted me a great deal. He looked like a really remarkable early version of the rise of the American meritocracy. I mean, Morgan goes from being an 18-year-old kid who shows up in the Shenandoah Valley penniless, and he becomes a brigadier general and a congressman over time, and a wealthy man and a great fighter, a great battle captain. So those were the kinds of things I was looking for.
So then we move from there into your newest book. So The Enemy Harassed, Washington's New Jersey Campaign of 1777. Before we dive into the book, let's talk a little bit about some of the players here. Let me just run down the list for you, and you can tell us a little bit about who some of these characters are that our readers are going to learn about when they read The Enemy Harassed. And I also want to remind everyone that if you want to ask questions, use the chat feature, and you can post your questions. I've got a slew of them, but I always try and get to some of our audience questions as well. So let's start with the Crown troops first. So who is General William Howe?
Well, General William Howe was in charge of the British Army in North America at the time. That is everything south of Canada. So he was basically the supreme commander of all British forces in North America, in the United States. And he had a good reputation as a good fighting man. He had a background in it, and he was a respected general.
So his premier field commander, General Charles Cornwallis.
Well, Cornwallis and Howe both come from noble families in England. Cornwallis was probably the best strategic thinker the British had. He was a good fighting general. The men liked him, and he was a good operational commander, probably one of their best.
William Erskine.
Erskine was also, he was a Scottish general. He was a division commander and pretty insightful. I think he may have given Cornwallis some of the best advice in the history of the Revolutionary War, but Cornwallis ignored it and he paid the price for it.
Captain Johann Ewald.
Ewald was a Hessian captain, wrote a great journal that I enjoyed reading. He seemed to be a very capable soldier. He was a professional and pretty even-handed when it came to dealing with situations between the British, the Hessians, and the Americans. If he saw something that he thought was poorly done, whether it was by the British or the Americans, he made note of it. His journal is worth reading. He gives an honest account.
So with also now moving on to the Americans, tell us about General William Maxwell and what his role was in these campaign of in 1777.
Sure. Maxwell was born in Ireland, I believe, and his family moved to northern New Jersey when he was very young. He fought in the French and Indian War as a provincial and rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. There weren't a lot of Americans that became officers prior to the American Revolution, so he had some knowledge of how to fight. When I got into this, I wasn't that familiar with Maxwell myself, but he was a very industrious officer, very aggressive, and the men seemed to like him, and he was very effective during this period of time. Washington liked him a great deal too, and he kept him with him. I think it was until the summer of 1780. So Maxwell was an effective officer.
How about General William Alexander?
Alexander, also known as Lord Stirling, because he had a claim to some British nobility, was also an effective officer. He fought with Washington on Long Island and is famous for holding the old line while the Continental line collapsed. And it's funny, I live here in Maryland, and Maryland, when I first moved here a number of years ago, I know it was called the Old Line State. I had no knowledge of why that even was. And I found out it was because Maryland troops were fighting on Long Island when Alexander patched together a fighting force to hold that line while Washington could cobble together something behind him. And it was a very big deal at the time. He also fought well during this period of time and fought and did the same thing, basically a rearguard action to allow Washington to escape with the main body in the summer of 1777.
So I've just put up onto the screen here for everybody to see. This is what New Jersey looked like the end of December in 1776. This is the 10 Crucial Days campaign. This map actually comes from Larry Kidder's book, The 10 Crucial Days. And what we're looking at here is the British, obviously in red, who have occupied the Jerseys in through the month of December. And you see over in the lower left-hand corner there, the Americans on the western bank of the Delaware River. So this is what it looks like before Washington's crossing and the battles of Trenton, Assunpink Creek, and the Battle of Princeton. After the Battle of Princeton, Cornwallis retreats north back to New Jersey, back to Brunswick and New York. And now we are looking at the Jerseys in January of 1777. You see the tide has completely turned around. The Americans are basically in control of the Jerseys, and the British are along the Raritan River. You can see down here up to New Brunswick, Staten Island, New York, and Long Island. So there's a very huge transformation between December and January, December 76 and January 1777. So what we're going to be talking about today is the battles that occurred during this 8-month period. Whoops, wrong slide there. Hang on a second. There we go. The battles that occurred between January of 1777, January 5th of 1777, and June 26th of 1777. So this is central New Jersey. So here you have Staten Island here, and here is the Raritan River right down here. So you have New Brunswick is right here. Here's Lawrenceville, New Jersey. Here's Trenton, New Jersey, Princeton, New Jersey. So you can see it's along that corridor. And what we're talking about today in the enemy harassed is the 8 months of the American Revolution that was shoehorned in history between the New York campaign and the Philadelphia campaign. Now, eminent Revolutionary War historian Mark Lender has called the Washington's campaigns of 1777 the Forage Wars. Draw a picture for us. What led to these forage wars? It really began at the 10 Crucial Days, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the Washington's campaign in New Jersey begins on the Delaware River when he crosses over on Christmas night and attacks Trenton and scores an amazing victory there. He then recrosses the river after that victory, crosses over again several days later, and moves on Trenton again to consolidate his army. He believes he's got the British on the run, but he doesn't actually. Howe has recalled Cornwallis, who thought he was going to go to England and visit his wife, and tells him to march as fast as he can to Princeton, gather force, and destroy Washington. So Cornwallis does just that. He marches down to Princeton, gathers between about 5,000 or 6,000 troops, and marches towards Trenton. Now, it's an interesting thing that the weather in New Jersey changed a great deal during this period of time, and often it tended to favor the Americans, almost like God was on the side of the Americans somehow. As Cornwallis was marching towards Princeton, a warm area happened, and the roads turned to muck and mud, and the British had to slog their way to Trenton all day long. They finally got there late at night or late in the afternoon, and they really couldn't begin too many operations. There was a little bit of fighting and so on, but they couldn't attack that night, and it's January and it became dark pretty quickly. Cornwallis was of a mind that he had Washington pinned against the river and could dispatch him early in the morning. Well, Erskine was the one who told him, if you believe that, they'll be gone in the morning. And Cornwallis did not take that advice and did not attack that night. That night, Washington had a meeting with his officers. They decided that they knew some back roads that could slip out of Trenton and march towards Princeton. That night, the roads froze hard, so they could march without any real problem throughout the night. And they showed up at Princeton the following morning, won another victory, which sent the British into craziness, because they were at Trenton and they heard the guns now behind them. And one of the things that many people don't realize is that at Brunswick, north and east of Princeton, Cornwallis had a major stash of supplies and cash in form of sterling, enough to support his war effort. And now Washington was between the British army and all that money and all those supplies, and he was scared to death that if Washington got a hold of that the war would change radically. Now, Washington also knew that stuff was there, and he desperately wanted to get it. So he was marching out of Princeton, and he got to a small crossroads at a little village called Kingston. And he had to decide what could he do. And he's looking at his troops, and he met with his officers, and his troops were marching by, and he realized these men are exhausted. I can't do anything more with them. They've been marching and fighting for 2 days. They hardly have any food. Many of them were marching through the snow and the cold with no shoes, no coats, no anything. And so he realized he had better not push on. Probably one of the wisest decisions he ever made, because his army had gotten caught on the flat roads between Kingston and Brunswick, they may have been wiped out. So Washington continued north, up through Somerset Courthouse, and as you pointed out, he goes into the Watchung Mountains in New Jersey, up to Morristown, where he makes his headquarters. Now, the Watchung Mountains aren't really that high, but they're formidable enough to be an excellent defensive position. Well, the British are really, how should I put it? They're completely turned upside down after the battles at Trenton and Princeton. Ewald states that he saw British soldiers and officers marching around Princeton like their heads had been turned upside down. They could not make sense of what had just happened. Prior to these two battles, they thought the war was only weeks away from ending. They were going to win it. Now it looked like Washington, as Ewald put it, looked like he had wings. He could drop out of the clouds on top of them. They were scared. Cornwallis decides he's going to get back to Brunswick as fast as he can, protect all of those supplies and all of that money, and they consolidate there for the rest of the winter and go into winter quarters. Washington is up in the mountains, but he realizes he can't keep all those people with him. They're going to have to forage for themselves across the countryside. He also wants to keep tabs on Cornwallis in his position there in Brunswick, and also be able to maybe harass him, which is the name of the book, harass him as well as he can if they attempt to come out of Brunswick. So the British are in Brunswick, and they have a nice supply line back to New York Harbor, but what they don't have is food for their animals. And their army has a vast train of wagons and artillery and caissons, but they need animals to pull it, and animals have to be fed. So that's when they look into the central New Jersey, and they start to think, well, central New Jersey is really a very agrarian place at the time. A lot of great looking farms, all the hay and the timothy and the straw has been put up in the barns by then. So they think, well, we can just go out and forage throughout New Jersey and get the forage for our animals. Well, they were attacked as soon as they ventured off into New Jersey by militias. First off, the British sent out small units, maybe a few hundred men with some wagons, and they were sent packing and sent back with casualties. This continued for a while. At one point in time, Cornwallis himself led a foraging expedition out to a small town called Wiggletown. That's what it was called a long time ago. It's now called New Market, of thousands of men. And he even had a diversion march off in a different direction to try to lure the Americans away. They fought the Americans all the way out. They got the forage they wanted, but they fought the Americans the entire time and fought them all the way back. So what was going on during this period is that there were no major battles. Washington really couldn't afford to fight a major battle, have the manpower to do it. But there was fighting all the time going around Brunswick, and to fight these foraging expeditions that were going on. So the British were taking casualties almost every day, and those casualties were adding up a great deal. So for the first 3 months of the New Jersey campaign, it was a battle over forage by and large, and the Americans were winning it. The Americans were losing men too, but the British weren't getting deep into New Jersey and getting a lot of supplies, and they were losing a lot of men. And General Howe started to realize it. So that's the first 3 months that are called the Forage War.
So I want to show everybody this list here. So what we're looking at here is the battles and skirmishes that took place, the major battles and skirmishes that took place between January 5th and June 26th. So you have approximately, well, no less than 34 battles and skirmishes in this 47-mile corridor between today's Hackensack, New Jersey, and Cranberry, New Jersey. Before we delve into these actions, what was the condition of the Crown troops and the Hessians in January of 1777?
Well, early on, it was pretty good. Like I said, they thought the war was going to be over probably in a matter of weeks. They had very high morale. It was a well-fed army, well-trained army, well-provisioned. They had the Americans on the run after the New York campaign of 1776, in which that went terrible for the Americans. They chased Washington across New Jersey. They had no real reason to think that they were going to be on the losing side of anything. So their morale was very high. After the 10 crucial days, their morale was very low. All of a sudden, they realized something radical had just happened. They really couldn't wrap their minds around it. As I said, Ewald pointed out that British soldiers could not grasp what had happened, and they had lost a lot of that fighting spirit. And so they were still very well supplied. They still had a lot of weaponry and horses and animals to do everything they needed, but their spirit had been dashed a great deal by what had happened during the 10 crucial days.
Now tell us the status of the American Army in 1777. I mean, what were the challenges with which Washington had to contend in the first quarter and into the second quarter of 1777?
They were immense challenges. I mean, the Americans were kind of the mirror opposite of the British. Their spirit rose dramatically as a result of what they did during the 10 crucial days. But they didn't have, victory doesn't give you food, doesn't give you shoes, doesn't give you clothing. And they still didn't have any of that. They felt a lot better about what they were and what they were about, that they could stand up to the British and fight. But the logistical system in the American Army was virtually non-existent. One of the key components here, too, that people need to understand is how the American Continental Army was organized by Congress to begin with. It was organized in terms of establishments. And the first establishment was simply that Congress adopted, so to speak, the occupation army around Boston in 1775. Then the second establishment was created in 1776, and it lasted, the enlistments lasted from January the 1st, 1776 to December the 31st, 1776. That was the second establishment. And those were the troops that Washington knew would be leaving if he didn't do something by the end of December. And that's why one of the reasons he made a move on Trenton. So the Congress had established a third establishment. So they were supposed to come in after the second establishment left. But Washington was in a position in New Jersey where the second establishment troops were marching off and the third establishment was not showing up. And they were not going to show up until late spring and even into the summer. So he was decidedly low on troops during this entire period of time. That was the primary dynamic that Washington had to deal with. He had almost no Continentals. We found a return from early June. I think he had 2,200 Continentals at the time. 46 of them were at Morristown with his headquarters. The rest of them were scattered all around the state. He had moved some posts forward to sort of circle, in a sense, Brunswick, and to sort of attack when the British came out, but also to keep an eye on Cornwallis and the troops there. But these were small groups. There were 1,000 men, maybe 500 men, and they were augmented on a monthly basis from different militias that came in. But it was still a very feeble army compared to Howe's troops that were in New York, and by March they had about 18,000 in Brunswick. So you can see that Washington was greatly outgunned and outmanned during this period of time. Regardless, they were very successful at resisting British efforts to get into New Jersey and forage. In fact, during the New York campaign of 1776, the British lost about 15, or I shouldn't say lost, they suffered about 15,000 casualties, 1,500 casualties, excuse me. During the New Jersey campaign of 1777, we've calculated that they lost at a minimum about 3,300 casualties they suffered. And it was probably greatly more than that, because a lot of the small engagements in New Jersey were never really even reported. Because you had local citizens firing at the British when they came out, and you had militias firing out at them, and state troops and Continentals. So they were really taking a heavy toll. The actions in New Jersey were taking a very heavy toll on British manpower, something that they could not withstand for long. So despite the disparities in manpower, the American side was really holding its own and being very effective during this period of time.
So just to take a step back here for everybody's benefit, first of all, Marge Sullivan asked that I share that spreadsheet, which I put in the chat feature. So you can actually see that spreadsheet that I prepared is in the chat. And Jim, spoke about the 10 crucial days. The first couple of chapters of Jim's book do a great job in sort of encapsulating what happened in the 10 crucial days, which of course are carried in much more detail in Larry Kidder's book, The 10 Crucial Days. And he also referred to the actions of the Battle of Assunpink Creek, which David Price writes about in his book, The Road to Assunpink Creek. So I encourage everyone to take a look for those books too. You can also find those at the bookshop at History Author Talks. And now, as we move into the Forage Wars, as Jim was saying, a crucial aspect of what Washington's manpower, what he had to rely on since the first, the third establishment of the army was sort of showing up in drips and drabs, and is the New Jersey militia, and which is covered in Larry Kidder's book, The Enemy Harassed and Exhausted. So I'm sorry, A People Harassed and Exhausted. So here Jim's book is The Enemy Harassed and Larry's book is The People Harassed. So everyone was tired, but there's a lot of vicious fighting going on, neighbor and neighbor. All of these thousands of troops, British, Hessian, Americans, have essentially invaded all of this farmland in central New Jersey, and Washington had to rely on all of these new regiments coming in. So Jim, tell us, what was the overarching dynamic that dominated Washington's strategic thinking in 1777, the campaign in New Jersey? I mean, did he have a plan, or was it just to keep an eye on the Brits?
Well, I think that his plan essentially was to survive, number one. I mean, his army really wasn't in a lot better shape after the great victories. Everybody was elated throughout the country who was on the rebel side or had sympathy that way over those victories, but that didn't make his army in any better shape. His best troops, his veteran troops were marching off in the second group, but the third establishment had not yet come in. And when they came in, they were raw troops, green troops with raw officers. And so he was losing veteran troops and gaining raw green troops. So he was in a very difficult position. That was the overarching dynamic. I think his strategy was simply to survive and cause as much havoc to the British as he could. In that, ultimately, he was very successful. He was desperate for a lot of things. You have to remember that he was really worried. I read a lot of his correspondence going in and out of Monmouth, or out of Morristown, excuse me. And he was constantly worried that the British would discover how low his troop levels were and that they would take advantage of that and attack. But fortunately, they never did. He was getting a lot of different information and having to plan on where to move next, but he didn't have the troops to move. So he was in a constant state of worry, quite frankly. But I think that he felt like if he could survive the winter and get to the troop levels he needed with the once the third establishment arrived, he would be able to fight then and maybe push the British out of New Jersey. That's one of the things I think he really wanted to do. He plotted with several of his commanders in New York. He wanted them to do a diversion towards New York. He had hoped that would draw off a lot of the British from New Jersey to defend New York City, because they couldn't possibly afford to lose New York with its deep water port. But that never really worked. But he was nevertheless able to, like we said before, harass the British a great deal and cause a lot of casualties that really turned Howe's head. After the Forage Wars were over, into early April, Howe started to realize he could not last in New Jersey very long, and he started to plot for where he was going to move next.
Exactly. And during that period of time as well, yeah, so he's now trying to come up with another strategy. And at the same time, we have John Burgoyne coming up with a different strategy. So this is starting to gel in the spring of 1777, where the British are coming up with a new a new strategy, which later turned out to be the Burgoyne's Saratoga campaign, and Howe is sort of trying to figure out what his next move is going to be. During this period of time, how would you categorize the British High Command and what their relationship was, what Howe's relationship was with his officers and with the Hessian officers? What was going on between these two allies at the time?
Well, Howe spent a great deal of the winter of 1777 in New York, quite frankly, living fairly well, and he left the field command in charge of Cornwallis at New Brunswick. It's hard to say exactly. I think the junior officers were starting to learn that, if they kept this up, the Americans were learning how to fight, and they were allowing them to learn how to fight by going out and being attacked constantly. And so they were starting to realize the Americans weren't the soft push they thought they were going to be. And if they kept doing this, it might be very difficult for them to fight a war in the future. I'm not so sure that Cornwallis or Howe ever really changed their attitudes. There's one particular engagement that really struck me early in April. Cornwallis organized and executed an excellent raid on an American position at Boundbrook, which is only about 8 miles away from Brunswick. It was probably should not have been an American base to begin with. They marched 4 columns overnight, attacked at dawn with 4,000 troops. The Americans only had about 500 men there. They completely ran the Americans off almost instantaneously, plundered the town, grabbed 3 cannons, about 80 prisoners, and marched back to Brunswick that morning. Now, when I was looking at the map, it struck me, first off, Boundbrook was on the right flank of the entire American front line, and New Brunswick fronted that line. So at this point in time, the British had the right flank and the front of the American line, and there were roads that ran from New Brunswick completely behind all the American positions. Had they simply marched troops up those roads, they probably would have forced the evacuation of many American positions, if not all of them, and probably in somewhat of a panic. But Cornwallis didn't do anything. He knew those roads were there because he blocked them with some troops, but he never thought about it. Equally, during this engagement, the Americans were run out of Boundbrook in the early morning. It took Washington, he sent a notice, once he got notice of the attack, he sent word to General Greene in Basking Ridge to go and support General Lincoln there in Boundbrook. It took him the better part of 6, 7, 8 hours to get there. Now, you would think that if Cornwallis was watching all this, he might have thought to himself, isn't that interesting? It took the Americans 6 to 7 to 8 hours to support a single attack on one of their little posts around here. There are a bunch of these little posts. Maybe we could take advantage of that. But they never did. They never thought anything about it. I am of the opinion that they had a sort of noble, and I don't use that word lightly, a sort of a nobility idea about they were going to win this war. They didn't really have to think it through real deeply. They didn't have to concern themselves with doing anything they didn't normally do. And that the war was already won. It was just a matter of time and they would win it. I see nothing creative going on between Howe and Cornwallis at all. And it's shocking. I think they could have had a very big development there at Boundbrook, but it escaped them completely. So I'm just of the opinion that they had a very arrogant sort of attitude that they were going to win this war. They didn't really have to consider it too much. It's going to happen.
So for those of you who live within driving distance, the reenactment of the Battle of Boundbrook is coming up on April 15th. And we get a lot of reenactors at the Battle of Boundbrook. So I encourage you to look at that, look for that. You can, by the way, if you go to the website for the New Jersey Society of the Sons of the American Revolution, that's njssar.org. I'm putting in the chat for everybody. You can find a lot of events in New Jersey that under the events tab, and you'll see the whole record of all of the events that are happening for the Battle of Bound Brook. Michael Spangler from our audience asks a great question here. Washington managed the rotation of newly arriving fresh but untrained manpower. How effective was this, or how did he effectively integrate the new regiments?
Yeah, well, Washington was very rational about the strength he had and the ability of his troops. So he was very wise about putting troops in with fresh troops in with troops that were already fairly veteran, militias sometimes that were veteran, and the holdovers that he had that knew how to fight. The officers also that he had in the field were pretty good. They were veteran officers, and they tended to know how to fight, and they came up with intelligent plans. So he didn't overtax those troops too much to begin with. I mean, you can give troops a lot of good weapons and everything they need, but if they're raw and they don't have good leadership, it's not going to do you very good, and they could run real quick. So I thought he was very ingenious about how he handled that.
And Bobby Bailey of the New Jersey DAR also adds to that there were newly created special regiments. There were additional regiments that were added to these enlistments, including a new reenactment group that's come up with the Spencer's Additional Regiment from New Jersey. And she points out that there were 16 of these additional regiments that were added during this period of time, which all goes to the conversation about, because of the successes of the 10 Crucial Days, you really had many of the men who were not only joining the militia, you had to be a part of the militia if you were, but there were new regiments that were now starting to stream in through March and April and May and June. So Washington's strength grew during this period of time. Let's talk about the citizens, though. How would you categorize the attitudes of the citizens of New Jersey during these actions? There were the supporters of the cause versus the loyalists, and was there a shift from one view to the other during this period of time? I mean, you have all of these farmers who are living in central Jersey here, and now they're having to contend with all these soldiers around them. What did they go through during all this period of time?
Well, I think you see a great shift in loyalties. From what my reading is that, initially before a lot of this fighting, the state was probably a third rebel, a third loyalist, and a third that really didn't care, somewhere in between. But as the British marched into New Jersey following Washington in 1776, there were widespread depredations during that period of time. There was a lot of looting. Farms were being looted, burnt. Men were being beaten, sometimes killed, women raped. When Ewald marched into the state with his Hessians, he was shocked by wide areas where people had just simply fled their farms and left. A lot of devastation, a lot of whole areas that were left wasteland by and large. And over time then, during 1777, while the British were in New Jersey, they treated the population pretty poorly. There was a lot of talk among the higher level leaders that they didn't want to hurt the individuals, they didn't want to upset the population, but their troops were doing it constantly, and they really did turn the population against the British. And the fighting in New Jersey was as much a revolution of, I think, of the people turning against the British occupation and their heavy-handed ways, as it was anything. I think they really turned, a lot of the people turned against the British. There were a lot of instances where individuals took action against the British, and people swarmed to, maybe not swarmed, but they definitely moved towards enlisting on the rebel side. And it was a huge factor. It's hard to understand The British did the same thing. I wrote about a book about the fighting in the South. Cornwallis had this idea constantly that there were all these loyalists, like under the rocks everywhere, and they would come out pretty soon as they found out that the atmosphere was correct for them. But there weren't that many loyalists, and everywhere they went, they seemed to turn loyalists into rebels. They took a very heavy hand to the people of New Jersey, and they paid a price for it.
So Washington did a lot of learning in the field. He really got smacked bad in the New York campaign. There were some brilliant maneuvers during the 10 Crucial Days. What did he learn during the Forage Wars in 1777?
I think he learned a great deal, in particular about the battle at Bound Brook that I was talking about before. If you look at his correspondence, just a few days after the Battle of Bound Brook, he wrote to William Maxwell very clearly, and he said, we have to pull our posts closer together. We have to have not just guards, but we have to have lookouts all over the place. We cannot be surprised again. He seemed to learn right away, this is not a good idea, what we have right here going. Within about another couple of weeks, he wrote a long letter to Benjamin Rush, in which he really outlined his thoughts at the time. At that point in time, he decided he was going to move his entire army away from those posts where they were scattered about, up into the first ridge of the Watchung Mountains at Middlebrook. It was basically a Gibraltar type position. And he sort of outlined his ideas to Rush, and he said, essentially, an army that's together can fight far better. They can fend off any attack far better, and we can also move down and go over to the offensive far more quickly than we could before. And a lot of what he wrote is what today people call the principles of warfare. He seemed to digest all of that and understand it very quickly and very clearly. And he moved to do that. He put all of his troops up at Middlebrook, in the Middlebrook Mountains there, a great position. I know Howe rode out once after a maneuver in the summer and took a look at it and just turned around and rode back. He had no desire to attack Washington in the mountains there. So he had learned a lot there, and he had never fought a foe like the British in the open before. So he had a lot to learn, and I was very impressed that he was open to learning. And like I said before, the British didn't seem to be learning much of anything. They just assumed they were going to win. Washington realized he had to learn how to fight this way, and he did. I was very impressed.
So tell us about we read a lot about Washington's disdain for the militia. What did he learn about the militia during this period of time?
Well, when he got into New Jersey, he had great disdain for the New Jersey militias. He considered them to be very unprofessional. A lot of them he thought were just using the war to rob their neighbors. And he wrote to the governor and really upset about what was going on with the militias. But over time, they seemed to come around. By the fighting in the later part of the spring, a lot of the militias were doing a lot of the fighting for him. At one point in time, I remember him writing to John Hancock and saying, the people and the militias, basically the people of the state, are up and rising against the British. And he was just thrilled with what was going on. He seemed absolutely thrilled that the people themselves were rising up and fighting. And I think the militias became far more professional, and he could rely upon them a great deal more than initially. He was pretty disgusted with them. They did not initially do a very good job, but over time they seemed to come around.
So I always get in trouble with my compatriots down in South Carolina when I say this, but there were more battles and skirmishes that were fought in the Jerseys than any other state. Certainly Washington spent more time in New Jersey than any other state. What was the significance? I mean, it was called the Crossroads. It's become known as the Crossroads of the Revolution. Why? What is New Jersey's importance?
Well, New Jersey sits between New York and Philadelphia. I mean, at the time, the four largest cities in the country were Philadelphia with about 30,000 people, Boston with about 20,000 people, New York had about 18,000 people, but a very deep water port, and Charleston, South Carolina had only 10,000 people. Those were the biggest cities in the country. So you had New Jersey sitting between two of the top three, with Philadelphia and New York. And so there was a great deal of transportation went up and down the coast. To get to South Carolina, by and large, unless you were going by water, on land along the East Coast, you had to go through New Jersey. And so there was naturally a lot of movement up and down through New Jersey, of all sorts of troops, and both British and American. And it was who held New Jersey held a very strategic place, because of the roads that ran through Jersey down to Philadelphia and south from there. That's why I think it's called the crossroads of the Revolution. There were, I mean, in this campaign alone, we've identified 132 engagements, large and small, just in central New Jersey. I mean, that's a lot of fighting that went on, and a lot of casualties suffered by the British.
So John Baxter in the audience asks a question, and I'm going to read his question, but then I'm going to change it a little bit, if you don't mind, John. He asks, do you see any evidence that William Howe's experience in New Jersey contributed to his decision to sail for Philadelphia and abandoned plans to support Burgoyne in northern New York and the Battle of Saratoga? And I just want to add to that a little bit, if I can. Regardless of what Howe's decision was to go and capture Philadelphia, I think it's probably safe to say that the reason that Howe decided that he was going to have to sail down to all the way down to the Chesapeake and approach Philadelphia from the south was because he simply couldn't take the short route through New Jersey. So speak to that if you could, Jim. Why do you think that what happened during the Forage Wars helped to make Howe's decision to go down to Philadelphia instead of going up to Burgoyne?
Yeah, I see no way you can interpret it differently. Why would he not stay in New Jersey and then march south to Philadelphia? Would be the easy way. Pacify New Jersey. You still got New Jersey. You have that corridor all buttoned up, and then you can just march down. But he knew that he had suffered so many casualties. If he turned and marched south while Washington was up and could come down on his rear, and the New Jersey militias were attacking them all along the line, he might not arrive at Philadelphia with an operational army, or it would be so reduced that he would be in big trouble as a commander. I think he knew that right off. He wrote to Lord Germain in April, as I recall, and outlined the fact that he was going to move. He didn't necessarily say he was going to move by water right then. Moving by water is an extensive and time to load up an entire army with all of its wagons and its artillery and everything. It's a lot easier to march than it is to sail. But he made the decision to go to the Chesapeake Bay. I'm relatively sure just to get out of New Jersey, because it had become a hornet's nest for his army. Every time somebody marched out or some column marched out, they took losses. They lost men, and it was depressing his troops. A lot of the British officers and men really became pretty violent as a result of what was going on. There were any number of engagements in New Jersey where the British really slashed apart prisoners that they had taken, or men that were Americans wounded on the field. They were losing a lot of their morale, and New Jersey was not a place that was fit for the British any longer, and Howe realized it.
So when the New Jersey campaign of 1777 was drawing to a close in June and early July, was the Continental Army better, worse off? Where are we from January to July of 1777 as far as the Continental Army is concerned?
Well, it's the third establishment's coming in, so the troop levels are going up. A lot of those men are still green, but the levels of the army are improving. So the spree of the army is also pretty good, because they realized they could stand up and fight against the British. A lot of men, a lot of junior officers got a lot of learning and fighting experience in New Jersey, and they came away knowing how to fight the British, at least on a small unit basis. And so I think they had gained a lot of experience, and a lot of good men had become veteran fighters. In terms of the logistics, it's pretty much as that would not be good until Nathaniel Greene was placed in terms of that in at Valley Forge. Really, that's until then the logistics of the Continental Army were almost non-existent, so that hadn't really improved.
But he's in quartermaster. Yeah.
Right. He was made quartermaster, and
Right.
now they subsisted pretty well in New Jersey. There was food for them and things like that, so they weren't starving or anything like when they marched off. So that was a little bit better. But in terms of the firepower, the munitions, and all that kind of stuff, not I would call that pretty much a push. But the attitude of the troops, the knowledge that they could fight the British and win, I think they had gained a lot from this period, and that's an enormously important aspect of fighting and winning a war. The idea that you can win a war, that people are motivated and think they really can fight and win, is huge. It's a huge thing. So they had that, and I think the British were a little bit discouraged after leaving New Jersey. I know a lot of the officers were upset with Howe because there were grumbling. There was a lot of grumbling when Howe left New Jersey. A lot of his officers felt like he had let the Americans push him around.
So in the annals of the American Revolution, everyone's heard of Lexington and Concord and Saratoga. Everyone's heard of the battles of Trenton and Princeton and Yorktown. Not many people have really focused much time on Bonhamtown, Quibbletown, Spanktown. But in Jim Stempel's Enemy Harassed, you're going to be reading a nonstop series of narratives of what happened almost every day from January through June of 1777. And it is written as a narrative. I am going to have a future show coming up very soon with Burt Dunkerley of the Emerging Revolutionary War group, and his book, The Unhappy Catastrophes, The American Revolution in Central New Jersey, 1776 to 1782. I talked to Jim and I talked early on. I wanted to get a book on the narrative of the Forage Wars. It's been covered in other books. I mean, David Hackett Fisher covered it, and Mark Krasny came out with a book a few years ago about the Forage Wars, about the actions in the Forage Wars. But this Jim's book is really the first full narrative. As it turns out, there was a third book that came out all at the same time. But it's a fascinating story, and millions of people live around Newark Airport and Elizabeth. And if you read The Enemy Harassed, you will never pass Newark Airport and think of, you'll think of it very differently from now on after you read The Enemy Harassed. It's an absolutely fascinating story. Jim has done a terrific job. We had some really wonderful historical historians who assisted in making sure that we got all of the history right. Full disclosure, I'm the publisher of this book. But as I said again, you purchase copies of Jim's book, a portion of the proceeds go to the SAR library, which is, we're all about education. And with that, I want to thank Jim very much for your time this evening. And I want to thank you all once again for joining us on History Author Talks, and stay tuned for more programs coming up. Thank you and good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
You bet. Take care.
Thank you.